your patients know what presbyopia is?
There are people who are afraid of the press.
Have you talked to your patients about multifocal contact lenses?
I've heard the bifocal, but not multifocal.
Exactly, not multifocal.
Do you need help with your multifocal strategy? Learn more at the conclusion of this episode.
Your eyes and your vision are under attack. Damaging blue light from the sun, your phone, your computer, your tablet, even light bulbs and car headlights is constantly bombarding you. The good news is our eyes actually already have a line of defense to counter the effects of blue light. This defense is made up of 3 pigments called carotenoids. MacuHealth with MicroMycel, the only supplement with the exclusive patent on all 3 macular carotenoids and MicroMycel technology.
With more screen usage and indoor time, myopia, also known as nearsightedness, is increasing and getting worse in children. Now, certified eye doctors can prescribe MySight One Day, the first and only FDA-approved soft contact lens to slow myopia progression in age-appropriate children. Visit CooperVision.com to find a Brilliant Futures certified eye doctor near you. Welcome back to part 3 of my interview with Dr. George Dallam. In part 3, Dr. Dallam discusses breathing techniques for athletes. If you're new here and you like our interviews, press like, subscribe, share, and hit the bell. Also, please leave comments. Be sure to watch our full-length documentary, Open Your Eyes, on Amazon Prime, Apple TV, iTunes, Google Play, and YouTube Movies and Shows. I want to ask you about the stitch that people get in this side from running, the ischemia that, or hypoxia that maybe they're getting to their stomach muscles. They're getting this stitch on the side, and some kids seem to get it, some kids don't get it. And talk about that, and can nasal breathing help with that?
So in our field, we have all these elaborate hypotheses around stitches because nobody could understand it, right? We've never really been able to explain it. So I kind of believe in the, if there's something fairly obvious, that's the most likely explanation, right? So, we know the obvious explanation for pain in a muscle that's transient during exercise, it's ischemia, right? That muscle's not getting enough blood flow. So if we go back and re-examine what happens when we breathe orally, remember I talked about the idea that we have a tendency to actually stabilize our abdomen because we're not breathing from the lower portion of the lung. We don't need as much abdominal excursion. So we put that abdomen into a state of, I wouldn't call it full-blown tetany, but a more continuous contraction. So if you're very familiar with how blood flow through a muscle works, during contraction, blood flow is reduced, and then there's a kind of a hyperemic effect as the muscle relaxes. So blood surges with contractions, right? And so in my mind, the most likely reason we develop stitches is because we're breathing orally, we're locking down our abdominal muscles, and also in beginners, like why you see stitches in every phys ed class when the instructor says, let's run a mile for time, is they never breathe like that. So also their abdominal muscles are just not conditioned. And so in locking down that abdominal musculature and kind of breathing from your chest, then we're creating some relative ischemia. Now, why it happens on one side more than the other probably goes to that whole positional asymmetry that human beings have, where we tend to dominate with one side of the lung versus another, having to do with how our pelvis is positioned. That's a whole topic that's very interesting too. Here's what I know though. So as a relatively accomplished triathlete, I was dealing with stitches, particularly during the running portion of races, particularly when it was hot, for a long time, probably 20 years. And I never really figured out a way to resolve it. And then some races, I can remember being in the lead of a race and having to slow to a walk because I was creating a stitch and then trying to get myself to the finish line. So when I adopted a nasal breathing problem, I never even connected those two things, right? I had not thought about it from that perspective, yet I stopped getting stitches. I have never had a stitch since then. So I had another elite athlete I was working with somewhere around 2010, and I had been talking to him about breathing nasally. And, that's a hard thing to get an elite athlete to buy into because they already are accustomed to and have already achieved a certain level of performance. But then he said to me, one of the problems I'm having is I get stitches in the run. And then I thought, okay, let's try the nasal breathing for that, right? So this is a guy, previously had run under 4 minutes in the mile when he was, I think, early in college. He's in his 30s now doing triathlon, still capable of running 30 minutes for 10 kilometers, right? An elite performer. We eventually got him within about 6 weeks to running a 5-minute pace in 1K efforts on a treadmill, breathing nasally. Stitches went away completely, right? So why is that? Well, once we start to breathe nasally and better engage our diaphragm, we get that relaxation and contraction and rhythmic expansion and reduction in the abdominal muscles, which is probably just allowing blood flow to occur more successfully, so we avoid that ischemia. I think stitches might be resolved as simply as, teaching everybody to breathe nasally in beginners, which will slow them down a little bit, but then they won't create that breathing pattern that encourages an ischemic response. And in people who already have a problem, especially well-trained people, adapting to breathing nasally, and I only have these 2 experiences, right? So that's what this is based on. It's completely anecdotal, but my guess is that will resolve stitches in those people as well. There was even an American record holder in the marathon, Kalud Kenichu, who struggled with stitches, even though he was very well trained. So it's not entirely about training status. It must have something to do with something else. But of course, he would have been breathing orally while he raced at that level.
What do you think about the train to do nasal breathing, mouth taping, or any of these types of tapes or apparatuses that people wear around their mouth to help people to breathe through their nose better?
So this is all practical, anecdotal, right? So when I first started doing this, I had worked back in the 80s with the Tohono tribe in Arizona and worked on the reservation for the tribe, right? I helped them to, in a process where they were trying to take over their healthcare system. And at the time, one of the things I learned was that don't introduce Anglo ideas to a tribe, allow them to create their own ideas about what makes sense to them in terms of exercise, et cetera, which was running, right? So I started reading more about Native American tradition running. There's a great book on it called Native American Running. And one of the things that stayed with me, even though I didn't experiment with this at the time, was the idea that in the book, they described the fact the Apaches would run with water in their mouth. So when I started doing this nasal breathing thing about 2005, it occurred to me, I'll just put some water in my mouth, and that will allow me to breathe nasally without having to think about breathing nasally, because if I try to breathe orally, I'm going to swallow that water. So I'm a big advocate of that approach, right? Because I'm not making a statement to people around me. I'm basically doing something they're not even aware of. Most people like that I train with or I'm around in a gym, they have no idea I do this until I explain it to them. They'll come up and ask me something and they wonder why I have to swallow before I answer them, right?
Oh, you're spitting in their face.
And then I try to explain because I don't,
They better not make you laugh.
Taping can accomplish the same thing, but the thing about taping is it makes a statement. And universally, in my experience, is if you make that statement, somebody's going to ask you, why are you doing that? Which means you have to stop, take that tape off, unless you're going to be a jerk, and explain to them why you're doing it, right? So I'm not against the idea of taping. What I've found is it's a little more seamless to use water in your mouth. That is important, though, because as soon as effort becomes such that you're no longer concentrating on your breathing, you'll revert back into that learned pattern that's already built into your nervous system. So if you actually want to maximize the rate at which you change this, you want to create conditions where it just happens, where you don't have to think about it happening. And putting water in your mouth is a pretty effective way. There's really no danger in that, right? Some people chew gum. I'm not so much a fan of that because you can actually still open your mouth. You just push that gum back and open your mouth. And also because you might swallow that gum accidentally. So I'm not a fan of that. I am a fan of using water. And, for some people, they want to make a statement. So sometimes people want that engagement. And for that person, taping might make sense.
I was really mostly talking about taping at night when you're sleeping.
So that's really interesting. Again, that thing I mentioned, which is my non-physician anecdotal view of where a lot of apnea probably comes from because of my own personal experience. One of the things that gets resolved if you have tape on your mouth, when you roll over into your back, is that your mouth doesn't fall open. So I could absolutely say this, that if it's safe for you to wear tape on your mouth, you'll absolutely resolve that problem of your mouth falling open. Now, there are other reasons that somebody might become apneic. That's not going to address everybody. Is there science around this? So at the time I wrote that section of the book, I haven't looked here in at least a year, but at the time I wrote that section of books, there were only 2 studies. One of them was supportive, right? It had looked at people taping and showed it reduced apneic episodes considerably. And the other study had looked at the phenomenon, I'm trying to remember the word they used for this, but where people try to breathe through that tape. So in some people with really developed apnea, when you tape their mouth, they'll still attempt to breathe through it. And they used a term for it, which for some reason is not coming into my head. That's a little scarier. That means they're not just reverting to nasally breathing, but they're still trying to breathe through their mouth. So, most physicians would be very scared of this, and rightfully so, right? If you tell somebody to do something, you have liability on the line. My basic practical sort of approach to this is, if you want to experiment with taping, A, you should be free of any significant nasal breathing problems, particularly. And B, you should do that while you're conscious and see if you can do that comfortably. So a really easy test that came out in the scientific literature, was used on more than 1,000 subjects, was simply to have you, close or tape your mouth and then sit for 3 minutes. What I normally say to people is, if you want to try taping during the night, when you watch TV for an hour or two, put some tape on your mouth and see if you get uncomfortable or not. We take that a little further in our lab. We'll actually have the person put some tape on their mouth and then measure their HRV. And if we see a significant adjustment towards sympathetic activation, we kind of recognize, okay, maybe you're not ready for this yet. We also then will have them do that at easy walking paces and see if, in fact, they regulate to a higher sympathetic activation state. Maybe you're not ready for that yet. And then if they don't, then we know we can start to engage them. Our objective is usually to engage them in exercise with the mouth closed, right? So again, my practical thing would be, I think this is effective. Limited science suggests it's effective, except in people with really advanced apnea who might actually try to override that response and actually breathe against the tape. And I think a common sense thing is, A, talk to your physician. Does he feel comfortable, or does she feel comfortable with your nasal breathing apparatus? Do you have some obvious reason you shouldn't try to force breathing into your nose? Like maybe, a really damaged nose. What's the term we use for when the one nostril has been damaged because of the
septum?
Deviated septum that's really severe. Get the clearance from that person, and then try it consciously, but where you're not thinking about it. And if you're okay and feel comfortable, and you can do that for an hour or two, chances are you can do that when you sleep as well. So
there was a study done with asthmatics and nasal versus mouth breathing. If you could talk a little bit about that.
So those 3 studies I mentioned in the 80s, they were all done with asthmatic patients, not people with EIB. EIB wasn't even a thing yet at that point. And they all showed the same thing, that the work levels that people could do breathing nasally did not induce a bronchoconstrictive response compared to them doing that same work breathing orally. So that didn't go anywhere, because somewhere a little later in the 90s, one of my former professors working with a researcher in Australia, they did a study showing just how much your VO2 max was reduced if you attempted to do that breathing nasally. So, if you think about most people who are engaged in exercise or particularly in athletics, they're all about performance, right? If you say to them, you could breathe nasally, it'll be protective, but you're going to reduce how much work you can do by a lot, they're going to be like, no way, right? I just won't do that. So I think that didn't catch hold, because I think at the time they believed it would compromise your work. So all that's changed is we've demonstrated, not that it doesn't compromise your work initially, it will, but that you can adapt to it. And that eventually it not only won't compromise your work once you're adapted, you might even improve your work capacity a little bit, which is why there is a small cadre of elite athletes, some of the best performers in history, who breathe nasally. And, even commentators are beginning to notice that now. I don't know if you're familiar with David Rudisha or remember him setting the world record so many times. So David Rudisha was the one who put the 800-meter world record seemingly out of reach. He still holds it. He ran a 140 eventually. So when you watch video of David running, he breathes nasally, right? Literally, you can see his mouth forced closed, and he does that the whole race. And of course, he's a Maasai warrior. That's a part of their heritage. Also, his coach at the time was an advocate of using at least some nasal breathing. So my guess is he experienced this and started to realize, hey, this is helping me. And then he created it as a habit, yet he never talked about it, right? Which elite athletes don't like to do. They don't want to give away what they do that they think is successful to other people. There's another woman, Lieutenant Sabet Gidey, who's held the world record at I think 1,600 meters, 5,000 meters, 10,000 meters, half marathon, 15K, and ran the second or third fastest intro marathon just a year or two ago. She's amazing. She exhales through her mouth. She uses like a pursed lip, right, where her mouth is just slightly open, but she's clearly breathing nasally. The commentators always mention it. They'll go in, and G'day is still breathing through her nose. And I mean, she's arguably one of the, if not the greatest female distance runner in history. So there's a few examples like that. They're almost all from African countries where there might have been a heritage cultural thing that exposed them to this early, the thought process that breathing nasally was important. And they've reached higher levels of performance than anybody else. That doesn't prove it's better. That suggests it's possible, right? If the best performers in history can do this, certainly it's possible to adapt to breathing nasally. That's the only reason I bring that up. I would argue it's probably performance. There's probably a performance advantage, but it's not a huge. It's not like their VO2 max is 10% higher or something because they breathe nasally. It's that they're now able to run at those high paces, breathing less and a little more efficiently. And when you get into elite performance, 1% is like a huge thing, right? If you can run 1% faster in 800 meters, and that's the world record versus say 143 becomes 140.8, you go from being a great runner to being the greatest runner in history off of 3 seconds. And if you can do that just because you breathe differently, that's a meaningful thing to an elite athlete. So
How about anxiety breathing? Someone who has a lot of anxiety, to get them to relax. Any tips with them? What should the cadence be?
yes.
How should they do that?
So when we get anxious, what's really happening is our brain is stimulating our sympathetic nervous system to produce a lot of energy, right? So we're getting sympathetically activated. When we do that, our metabolism increases, CO2 production goes up, and we start feeling that CO2 getting higher in our blood. And that's tied to the anxiety, right? We get this sense of not getting enough air. So when you see somebody in a panic attack, if you ask them, are you getting enough air? They're going to say no. They're breathing like that because they feel like they're not getting enough air. So the most immediate response to that is to open your mouth and breathe really fast, because that will, again, favor that CO2 removal and help to keep that in control. But the problem with that is that it's when you start to do that, even though you're helping to remove that CO2 more quickly, you're probably also vasoconstricting in your heart and your brain. So, one of the things, if you're ever in the horrible situation of seeing somebody who can't get a panic attack under control, they eventually lose consciousness because they don't get enough oxygen to the brain. In some cases, in people who already have well-established heart disease, as I mentioned earlier, they sometimes then have a heart attack, right? They might have a heart attack, infarct, and maybe even arrest right on the spot because of that breathing pattern. So when I was 2 times ago on sabbatical, my son was still in middle school and wrestling, so I helped with their wrestling program. I can still remember one of the women, one of the young girls who was wrestling. She got into a match. The referee was on the wrong side. The boy really didn't want to be beat by a girl, so he started choking her. And the ref was just positioned badly. He wasn't seeing it. I'm sitting right across. I'm like screaming at this ref. Finally, the ref realizes what's happening, stops the match, but she went into a full-blown panic attack. So my advice to her was to first try to slow her breathing, and then as soon as I felt like she could, to try to close her mouth and breathe nasally. And so why does that work? Well, as I start to breathe nasally, I start to rebuild that CO2 in my blood. I start to stimulate my parasympathetic response to bring my anxiety down. It's not easy to do because initially it feels like the exact wrong thing to do, but it's what stabilizes the situation. It's also why people, quite commonly go to the idea of breathing in a bag. When you breathe in a bag, even through your mouth, what you do is reventilate that CO2. So that also drives your CO2 levels back up. I don't think that's quite as effective if you can get that person into a nasal breathing pattern, because that doesn't necessarily directly innervate the parasympathetic response, but it does change the CO2 level. So my suggestion is just to talk them into trying to breathe more slowly, try to get them to focus on something, because what's going on in their brain is that fear response where we have these thoughts running quickly. And then as soon as you can, bring them into a nasal breathing pattern. So it took me about a minute or 2 with this young woman, but then we got her into a nasal breathing pattern. Within a minute after that, she was fine, almost ready to go wrestle again.
MacuHealth, your science-born and tested solutions for visual performance, macular degeneration, and dry eye syndrome. New products coming soon. Embrace the science.
I want to ask you about the Bolt score.
Yes.
And what's your feeling about that for the people that are listening to do a Bolt score? And then how should they train at home to become a nasal breather?
So the Bolt score, which I'm never sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but and I don't think he was a physician. I believe Pichek was actually like an engineer. The concept that the Bolt score tested oxygenation, completely wrong. What it did test was CO2 levels in the blood, right? Because if I stop breathing, it's minutes before my oxygen levels, even my arterial oxygen level, it's minutes before that starts to drop, right?
And that's
However,
what it's saying.
CO2
That stands for body oxygen level test. And if
Right.
you could continue and then tell us how to do it so people could test themselves at home to see if they're what their level is.
So more recently, people have been using different ways to refer that don't refer to oxygen, that refer to CO2, because that's really what it's testing. And it's testing your sensitivity to CO2. How rapidly do you start sensing respiratory drive and air hunger as your CO2 starts to rise instantly when you stop breathing? So it's really simple. I do this actually with my students as one of their first lab experiences. You simply have to have like a stopwatch or something, kind of be in a regular relaxed breathing pattern, and then just stop breathing mid-exhalation and just wait for that first thing that suggests, okay, I should take a breath. It's not a test of how long you can hold your breath. It's a test of the first sensation of when you feel like you should breathe, and you just time that, right? So, to be honest, my students very typically only go about 9 seconds, right? And they're exercise science students. Most of them are athletes. Most of them are involved in training or one way or another. So, it is the case, and I will put this data in my book. It is the case that this high sensitivity to CO2, it's pretty rampant, right? That most modern humans are overly sensitive to CO2, in my estimation. So how is that useful? Well, what Pichek envisioned was the idea that as you became less sensitive to CO2 and able to breathe more of the time nasally, that would resolve many physical health problems, which he was on the right thread for sure. And that's absolutely the case, right? If you do things to improve your tolerance to CO2, it starts getting longer and longer before you sense that urge to breathe. It makes it less and less likely that you open your mouth as the antidote to that, right? Because again, oral breathing favors dropping your CO2 level. It's very easy to do. It's very trackable. The one problem is that exercising breathing nasally, which clearly increases your CO2 tolerance, I don't know that actually connects very well to a resting test. So nobody's formally studied that. Everyone is speculating that it does. I'm not really sure that it does from my own experience, right? I mostly increased my sensitivity to CO2 in that resting kind of test by doing resting breathing exercises where I essentially breathe more slowly, the stuff that Pichek advocates. I didn't really develop a very high tolerance for CO2 in that condition, even though I was adapted to running all the way to VO2 max, breathing nasally. So I'm not sure I could explain why that physiology that's occurring during exercise doesn't necessarily translate back. I still think it's an important way for somebody to figure out that, okay, increased chemosensitivity is going to help me to breathe nasally more of the time. That's going to improve my health generally. We just need a better way to connect the two, right? Because I don't think we can say simply exercising breathing nasally will cause this to improve in a resting test. Clearly, your capacity to exercise is the best way to test your CO2 sensitivity during exercise.
Great. And how could somebody train to become a nasal breather while they're home? They're listening to this. They've listened to this. Okay, I want to do this. How can I train myself to do it?
So even if you're not interested in exercise, I think it's a very useful thing to do something like the Bolt test. Again, I think it's misnamed, to just see, how quickly do I feel a sensation? Ideally we push it out around 30 seconds or more. And so what's the first way to develop that? Just use breathing exercises, which essentially are very simple, right? We have all these variations that have come from different people, but essentially they start to breathe more slowly, right up to the point where you feel a little bit of air hunger. So box breathing, or, there's various formulations. They're all the same thing. We simply want to slow our intake maybe add a little bit of pausing, slow our outflow, typically emphasizing slowing the outflow, the expiration more than the inflow, because that's where the big parasympathetic response is really occurring. And then maybe even increase the time in between. And rather than saying there's one specific way to do it, like box breathing is taught as 4-4-4-4, I would say do that to your current tolerance. So if after 2 seconds, where I do a 2-second inhalation, a 2-second hold, a 2-second exhalation, if I'm beginning to feel a little air hunger after I do that a few rounds, good. And then as that sensation reduces and I can go a little longer or do more rounds, that shows you your progression. That's that motivational environment of you're seeing that you're actually progressing in your tolerance for CO2. The part about changing your habit of how you breathe during the day is very problematic, because during the day, like what we're doing right now, I noticed in this environment for teaching that my mouth was open all the time. Even when I wasn't talking with the students, I would see myself and see my mouth was open because I wasn't thinking about it. So it's an operant behavior concept. So I am a big advocate of using things like taping, water, or other things that create the condition where your mouth stays closed more of the time without you having to consciously regulate that, and then build in what we call operant behavior principles, right? Get people to tell you, okay, your mouth's open, close it. Stuff that keeps getting you back to consciousness about it. And then I would argue that, using the taping, which does that during sleep, right, which automatically means you're now going to spend 6, 7, 8, 9 hours in a nasal breathing condition. If it's safe for you to do that, that's a great technique, right? Because now half of your day or a third of your day is now spent where you're in a nasal breathing condition the whole time, which means you're training your nervous system to breathe that way. About the exercise part, what I suggest is that if you find that you can walk breathing nasally, then just slowly progress that. I'm a big advocate, since we have treadmills everywhere and bicycles everywhere at home and in gyms, of doing what we would call a progressive warm-up. So in a progressive warm-up, we start at a very low level, breathing nasally, and in maybe 3-minute stages, we keep progressing the work in little increments, being sensitive to how we feel, using some kind of a rating scale. We typically use a 1 to 7 scale. 7, like I feel like I'm being held underwater. 1, I'm just normal. To rate that sense of air hunger, find out where you first begin to have a little bit of a problem with that, and then train just below that level, and then keep reassessing that fairly frequently. Every week, 2 weeks, do that warm up in that way again, and see if you're making progression forward. Am I able to go a little further without that same sensation? That's the most seamless way to adapt yourself to doing more and more work breathing nasally without having to be really uncomfortable while you're doing it. Of course, you're going to get the young guy. There's a published study about a student who did this, a Ph.D. student, where he literally pushed himself as hard as he could breathing nasally, and he did adapt, but he went through hell to do it, right? That's not really necessary. You don't have to go through feeling like you're going to die or like you're going to suffocate. You should never feel that way, right? Just find the level of work where that's just beginning to start, and then you'll see that you'll downregulate. You'll be able to go further and further, and before you know it, you'll be back to whatever work level you're accustomed to, or going even further.
I find sometimes when I'm lifting weights, it's hard to stay nasal breathing, that I do have to mouth breathe at times.
Yes, that's really interesting, because there's a little bit of work on that. There's a paper coming out here shortly that I just ended up looking at, and there's another paper that's been out there for a long time, both looking at anaerobic conditions. And so in both of those papers, they showed that how you breathe had really no effect, but those papers didn't investigate the air hunger associated with it, right? Was this also producing some post-set air hunger? So I would suggest, do you do some aerobic exercise too?
Mm-hmm. I do.
I would suggest it's really the same idea, right? As you increase your capacity to do aerobic exercise without feeling that discomfort, and you keep, trying to do your nasal breathing during your exercises, maybe giving yourself a little shorter set, a little longer recovery time to find that place where you can actually do that set without feeling overly uncomfortable. You'll see that they'll both progress in the same direction. I say that because I also, train pretty extensively in the gym. I'm a big believer in power supporting endurance and strength supporting power, and of course, musculoskeletal health. And so, I find that I have no issues around that, and they kind of went together, right? As I adapted to breathing in the endurance mode, breathing nasally, I found it relatively easy to also do that in the in the weight room, because the weight room is very anaerobic, but not sustained. And the thing that will produce air hunger the quickest is sustained high rates of ventilation. So if you're a trainer who like pushes to failure and you go to a really high ventilatory rate after sets, yeah, I could see you might experience some air hunger there. I would also argue that's not the best way to train. That's a whole nother topic. The evidence around the idea of training that point of high acidity, where you have like a lot of hydrogen ion and you feel a lot of discomfort and you're ventilating really hard, trying to clear that acidity, isn't there. It's a sort of a mythology of weight training. We actually do better knocking the reps down a few, training in a more controlled way, still working at the same intensity, the same weight, for instance, because that's the stimulus that makes the muscle stronger. And then being able to recover less and accumulate more work at the target intensity in a way that's more comfortable, right? Where we don't actually have to experience that failure. When we look at the studies on failure, they produce the same response as controlled training over short term, but over long term, when we start looking at studies past 12 weeks, the more controlled approach, they get better progressions because the other people drop out more, right? They just can't tolerate that kind of training as easily. So some people have adapted their minds to doing that. I would still argue that's not the best way to train in the weight room. Think of the stimulus being the weight you're moving, how many times you've moved it, meaning the work you're accomplishing, not how fatigued you get, right? So if you use a strategy to reduce your fatigue in that approach and end up accomplishing more work, you have more stimulus for the thing that you want, which is to get stronger or more hypertrophy, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, and as we're finishing up, my last question makes me think, from what you're saying, do you think there's any difference between heavyweight, low reps, or lightweight, high reps for building muscle in the end? Do you think there's a difference? That obviously we're always, we're brought up we're told, maybe it's a myth. You want to build muscle, you got to use heavy weights, low reps. If you want to build definition, high reps, low weight. But I saw a study that after a certain, maybe it was 3 months, there was no difference. And I was wondering if you, as an exercise, a PhD in exercise physiology, if you agree with that.
So when we stimulate our muscle with some kind of force, there's this concept we call a ramping principle of how we recruit the fibers. So at low levels of force, we recruit more oxidative, what we might call slow twitch fibers. As forces get higher, we ramp up and recruit more and more fibers. So one of the hallmarks of training is that you don't train at one intensity, because one intensity only fatigues the fibers that actually come to fatigue at that intensity, and fibers that don't get recruited aren't even stimulated. Also, when you train at higher intensities, those fibers that are recruited only at lower intensities, they're never taken to fatigue. It's only the higher level. So, we would refer to this as complex training. Right? In endurance sport, that might reflect, a marathoner who runs at marathon pace. They might run at half marathon pace or tempo. They might run at 10K pace for certain workouts. They might run at mile pace. They might even run at 400 meter, 800 meter pace sometimes. Each of those is fatiguing different fibers. Well, in the weight room, the same thing applies, right? When we train at one intensity all the time, there's only one type of fiber that really gets fatigued at that intensity. So one of the first things I talk to my students about is throwing out the old ideas that weight training is one thing, right? The weight training is just I go in and I work with 8 reps of this weight, right? Weight training should be like endurance training, complex, meaning that one day I might work with a lighter weight, recruiting lower level fibers, but for more reps where they become fatigued. Another day I might work with a heavier weight. Typically, when we periodize weight training for athletic performance, the outcome is power. So we periodize it with 3 concepts, some endurance, lighter weight, some maximum strength, heavier weight, and then power, where we actually reduce the weight so we can move that weight proportionally faster and generate higher rates of power. So depending on how you want to organize what those different intensities are, the real idea, though, is that we're going to get the best response in the muscle, both in strength and hypertrophy, if we hit it with different intensities, and that we're recovering from each of those different intensities separately. So let's take a bench press. Let's say you like to bench press heavy at like 85% of max. So you do like maybe 5-6 reps at that, and you go to failure, right? You do like 3 sets. What I would suggest is first, back that down to like 3 reps. So you're not getting that failure point. do that one day. Another day, come in with a lighter weight where you might get all the way out to maybe 15 reps. Another day, come in with a weight that maybe is even heavier, where you might only do a couple of reps. And those different stimuli will start recruiting all of the fibers you have available. Plus, you fatigue from each of those separately from the other, even though it's in the same movement pattern. So you're going to see better adaptation to each thing, right? If I come in and train the same way 3 days a week, what I inevitably do is just overtrain, which people talk about in the real world as plateauing, right? Well, I plateaued. Eventually humans reach their limits for capacity, but it takes like decades to do that if you're training intelligently. So what you do is adapt to each of those separately, and you give yourself more time. So I would argue that the idea that we can adapt to a neuromuscular stimulus at a high level over a day or two is idiotic, right? All of the data would suggest it's 7, 8, 10 days. And if it's a super high stimulus, maybe even longer. So we have to figure out a way to train to give ourselves that much time between each session, but still have the satisfying experience of going in and being able to train as frequently as we like to. One of the ways to do that is just use different intensities in each of those sessions, even when it's in the same movement pattern. So when we get into the hypertrophy side of it, we're not just thinking about strength in a movement pattern, we're now wanting to just generally get more hypertrophy, bigger. The other factor is, each movement pattern is its own thing. We don't really train muscles, we train these movement patterns. So the more different complementary movement patterns we build in, the more total hypertrophy we'll get, which is why bodybuilders do all kinds of exercises. A big piece of that is that they be balanced or complementary. So, joints work with the idea that muscle tension on both sides of that joint are appropriately proportionate. One of the fundamental errors people make in training is to train sort of one muscle group much more than the other, like bench pressing all the time and never pulling. And so then we create imbalance in the joint, we create dysfunction in the joint by doing that. So a piece of that idea of expanding on the exercises is also doing that in a complementary way. If I'm going to do 3 sets of bench press, I want to do 3 sets of a pull, essentially just the opposite motion. And then I create balance in the musculature. So, you start combining those ideas and you start doing the same things that bodybuilders have figured out over the years to do, what they call splits and things like that, where they never train that specific movement too frequently, where they ideally use some different intensities. And then the last piece I would say about this is that we tend to think of like a single stimulus as optimal. But when we're talking about the end point, we're talking about strength, the amount of work you have to do or the intensity of work you have to do keeps increasing as you adapt. So if you take somebody who's never lifted a weight in their life, even 50% of their 1RM or their max might be enough to start to build some strength and would be a safe way to build strength, right? But as they get stronger over the years, that relative intensity increases, which is why people who compete in powerlifting at the highest level, national champions, et cetera, their workouts look like this. They might do 8 sets. They might never do more than 3 reps. There'll be at least a few of those sets that'll be 1RM attempts. And that might take them 2 hours to do that. And that might just be in the squat, right? So there's a squat day they go in. It takes them 2 hours to do 8 sets. They do a huge amount of recovery, and they never do more than like 3 reps because their body, their response to training, to creating strength has increased so much that the only stimulus that further increases strength is getting right near their limit, right? Really, literally recruiting almost all their available fibers. So that's the other thing, is that you're slowly over time making progressions towards higher relative weights, not with the idea of going to failure, but with the idea that I can still do that in a very controlled way. And I do that as I get these really well-developed movement patterns. They're very balanced, and I can do it safely, right? That I know what I'm doing, basically.
Well, I want to thank Dr. George Dallam for visiting with me today. We went through encyclopedic knowledge of nasal breathings, a little bit of coaching, and a little bit of helping us with exercise. I really want to thank you. And if people want to find out more about you, how can they do that?
So I'm still teaching. I'm pretty easy to find on the internet because my last name is like Dallas, only M instead of S. And it's an unusual name. We're not a big family around the country. So if you just search my name, you'll typically find me. I did want to say this before we were done, Carrie. I watched your video. I hadn't seen it before. And I was enthused by it tremendously, right? Some of the ideas presented in the video, the one you created,
the documentary.
this idea of really recognizing that the window you have as an ophthalmologist into cardiovascular status, where you can look at it non-invasively, is such a valuable thing. Those are great ideas. The ideas that were talked about with some of the researchers and physicians you talked about relative to why it is we got to believe that carbohydrate intake was so valuable and why we were so wrong about that. That's a worthwhile video to watch. So I'm assuming people who watch this probably have already seen your video, but if you haven't, you should watch it. It's good.
Well, I really appreciate the plug for the documentary, and I really appreciate it as an optometrist. We just want to get the word out how important the eye is and how important getting your eyes examined is. So I really want to thank you for joining me. And, this is a topic, and I'm going to share with my patients, because that have different types of disease. Why not? You might as well breathe right, get more oxygen, 15 to 20% more oxygen to the tissues. It makes a lot of sense to me, and people don't think about this. And I really want to thank you for the work that you're doing and helping people. And thank you for your work, and thank you for being my guest.
Your eyes and your vision are under attack. Damaging blue light from the sun, your phone, your computer, your tablet, even light bulbs and car headlights is constantly bombarding you. The good news is our eyes actually already have a line of defense to counter the effects of blue light. This defense is made up of 3 pigments called carotenoids. MacuHealth with MicroMycel, the only supplement with the exclusive patent on all 3 macular carotenoids and MicroMycel technology.
Fitting multifocal contact lenses presents a big opportunity to meet patient needs while growing your practice. Alcon is your partner not only with our innovative portfolio, but through e-learning. Learn to enhance your multifocal strategy today with the Alcon Experience Academy.
OIE Broadcasting is the emerging leader in social media. We use scientific entertainment to drive more patients into your office. Visit oiebroadcasting.com and sign up today.